Welcome everyone. Welcome to Glebe and welcome in particular to Nikos and of course to Yaron to Sydney. Originally this was going to be capitalism in the pub and it has become capitalism next door to the pub, and so we'll retire after this event over there for a few drinks for anyone who wants to hang around. We're going to be discussing what is capitalism, why it's important, how it features in our explanation of why it is that we exist in a society that's thriving and flourishing to the extent that it is. I see capitalism as part of a three-pronged fork, if you like, of error correction. We need and depend upon our ability to express ourselves freely. The free speech is absolutely crucial and fundamental to the existence of our dynamic civilization. Alongside of free trade or capitalism, both of those, free speech and free trade, are morally prior to, and logically prior, to democracy, the free vote, which is the third prong of the necessary basis of a civilization that is dynamic and what David Deutsch has referred to as being a new kind of tradition. I know that Ayn Rand is not a fan of tradition, but this is a new kind of tradition in the Enlightenment, and that is a tradition of criticism, where we expect change, we expect progress, and the way in which it happens is no idea is off the table for improvement. Everything can be challenged, criticised and improved. At the moment, we all live in mixed economies to one extent or another. Why is it that as we tend in the direction of more and more freedom in markets, we have more wealth and more prosperity, but as we tend in the other direction, things tend to fall apart? Poverty begins to reign. So what explains this bizarre situation where regulations increase, taxation increases, the overbearing governments of the Western world seem to be on the ascendancy at times, and there's little choice to be made whether you vote for this candidate in this party or that candidate who is ostensibly the opposition? And so I'll begin with Nikos and say, what is capitalism? Why do we need to defend it, and what's going wrong right now?
Yes. So the way I think about it is capitalism, first and foremost, is an achievement, a historical achievement. Think about the history of humanity. For 99.9% of the history of humanity, life sucks. We live in, today, what we'd consider subhuman conditions. And why is that? Because we hadn't understood what type of beings we are and what do we need in order to live a good life. So capitalism comes after another great achievement, which is the Enlightenment, where people figure out two things. The first is that we live in a world that is ruled by relations of cause and effect, that we can understand things because we have a mind. And this mind is our tool of understanding how this world works, but also how we can change this world. That was the one great achievement. The second is that to do that, we need freedom. So an achievement on the level of thought, what type of world we live in and what type of beings we are, combined with a political achievement, which is, therefore, this type of being needs to be free. This is what capitalism, in very simple terms. It is not a perfect competition or whatever the economists will tell you. First and foremost is, what type of being are these humans, and what type of life, what type of environment do they need in order to live and thrive? So capitalism is this environment, this playing field in which human beings can live a good and flourishing life. That's how I understand it in very simple terms.
And then what that environment is an environment in which the one enemy of the human mind, the one enemy of our ability to go out and error correct, to use Brett's terminology, is an environment of freedom. It's an environment in which we recognize something essential about human beings, and that is that they have rights. They have individual rights. And rights are recognition. They're recognition that a being of reason must be free of coercion. That a being of reason cannot act effectively in the world if it's under a gun, under a threat, if it has to appease an authority, or if it has to do what it is told. So capitalism is a system that recognizes individual rights, which means that extracts force from society. It says you can do whatever you want in the world. The one thing you cannot do is use coercion and force against your fellow man. You can think, you can experiment, you can test, you can try, you can challenge any idea. What you cannot do is use coercion on somebody else. What you cannot do is punch somebody, pull out a gun, rape, pillage. Those are unacceptable. And so capitalism is the social, political, economic system that recognizes individual freedom, that recognizes that individuals have rights, that individuals are free to pursue their happiness, pursue their values, using their reason without any coercion or force placed upon them. And what it implies, therefore, is that the agency of force, we have an agency of force in our world. What's the agency of force? Government. Government is our agency of force. Every government is an agency of force. It means that the agency of force, the agency of coercion, has no business in our lives other than to protect us. That it is there to help protect our property rights, to help protect literally our lives, to protect our freedom of action, to protect us from one another. And in some sense, if we structure the government right, to protect us from it, right? One of the reasons the Founding Fathers of America create so much separation of powers and division within the government is so that the government is self-correcting, so that the government protect us from it, right? So capitalism is the separation of state from our lives. It's the separation of state from economics. It's the separation of state from science. It's the separation of state from education. It is, in its pure form, where the government does nothing but police, military, and judiciary, where it helps define new forms of property rights when property is new forms of property rights, property is discovered, but otherwise leaves us alone. It's very small, very limited in its scope of action.
People are categorically different, it's quite obvious, but what makes the difference between a person, a thinking being of reason, and any other species that has existed throughout the course of history, geological history, biological history here on planet Earth? It is this capacity to see a problem out there in the world and to generate a solution via the creation of explanatory knowledge. And the thing about problems is they cannot be anticipated ahead of time. You encounter a problem. Next Tuesday afternoon, the asteroid comes from the sky or the new virus is detected. Any number of things can assail us. And one of the reasons that we require systems of liberty to be protected, in particular the free vote, as I say, the free trade and free speech, is so that we can talk about the problems yet to be encountered. And as soon as something like government gets in the way and attempts to prophesy, to predict what the content of our future problems is going to be, what the most crucial problems are for all of us to tackle, we then end up in a collectivist mindset, because the government is saying, here's the problem that you need to be agitated about. Here is why we need to collect together in order to, for example, ensure that the atmosphere doesn't increase in temperature by X number of degrees, or this is the reason why we all need to get together to ensure that China's tariffs are at a certain level, and so we're going to level tariffs at them. Because government tends to have this desire to protect and control in an attempt to guess at the problems of the future, there has been a tendency of people to feel comfortable that somehow or other government is on their side when it comes to things like regulation and how best to use your money, for example. And so I'll go back to, why is it that we seem to be sliding backwards in some places, certainly in places like the United States, which perhaps have been one of the nations that have most closely approximated the ideal that Ayn Rand talked about. Ayn Rand celebrated the United States as being a beacon of liberty and being a beacon of wealth creation. And yet we have seen, ever since, pick a number, the 30s or 40s, an increased number of regulations, an increase in income tax and that kind of thing.
Yeah. First of all, let's make something very clear. Progress is not something which is automatic, or we don't live in a Marxist universe where there are historic laws where we're all going to go forward. There are many examples, the most extreme being Cambodia, which, when it was run under the communists, in 3 years and 8 months, went from a country of the 20th century to something close to primitivism. There was literally rewildering in the cities. What this means is that if we want to maintain progress, civilization, I would say, they need to have a base. To use now Marxist terminology, the society we have, the progress, the economic system is a superstructure. The basis are the ideas. So why has capitalism been retreating? To put simply, because no one bothers to defend it. And when I say no one bothers to defend it, I also mean its supposed supporters. I also mean people, for example, who claim that, well, capitalism is good as long as it delivers the good to the people who need it, which to me sounds a lot like a central plan where your property and at the end of the day your life is on mortgage. Unless you deliver to those in need, then you are not allowed to go on with your life, which means at the end of the day, you are a servant. Your body, your work does not belong to you. But because these ideas are very, very popular, by default almost, capitalism will retreat because no one will stand to defend it. And that's why I called it in the beginning an achievement. It was a historical exception, a 0.1% of history historical exception. And we need to appreciate it as precious because otherwise it will retreat even more.
Yes, a few things. I want to comment on something you said, Brad, about what makes human beings. You know, in a sense, the ability to identify problems and solve them. It's a little bit, I think, more basic than that, right? Because the reality is that every other animal out there is born with, in a sense, the knowledge to survive. The very, very, very fundamental knowledge of how to eat and how to relatively thrive, and all of that is programmed in. They know exactly what to do. Human beings, in a sense, are born with a certain hardware, but with very little software. And we get to program. We get to program the content of our own consciousness. So even at the very basic level of the problem of how do we get food, and don't say from the supermarket, but how do we get food, a primitive man had to figure it out. That is, had to solve a problem. Had to actually use their reason, their faculty of reason to solve an existential problem. So from the very, very beginning of humanity, from the very, very beginning of us as a species, we solve problems. We use reason to survive, to exist. So it's not just in the future. To see the future, we have to look at the past and see that, again, from the very, it's in the very nature, because we don't have it programmed. We just don't have the programming to know how to survive. None of you know how to farm. I mean, if you know how to farm, you've learned it. You've figured it out. Somebody has helped you figure it out. None of you know how to hunt. There's no hunting instinct. I've never met a human being with a hunting instinct. And we're physically not very capable of hunting, right? Look around the room, pretty pathetic audience. Right? You guys are weak, you're slow, you don't have claws, no fangs. You try running down a buffalo and biting into it and eating it. No, I mean, you can't. Or what do you need to do? You need to develop weapons, you need to develop strategy, you need to develop, traps. You need to develop ways in which to capture the bison, and then knives in order to cut that thick skin that they have. Because we're not born with those tools attached to us. We have to create them. Creating those tools requires an act of creativity. It requires thinking. It requires reasoning. It requires solving a problem. So it's at the very nature and the very beginning. And in that sense, every baby, as they grow, what they need to do is learn and develop skills to solve problems. to do the thinking, to do the reasoning, to grow. So I just wanted to make that comment on kind of the basics. What was the question about capitalism?
Why it's retreating.
Why it's retreating. And the fundamental reason that capitalism is retreating, it has to do with the fact that, I'll phrase, capitalism is built on two fundamental ideas in my view. Two fundamental ideas. One is that human beings require reason in order to survive. And reason is our only means of knowledge. There is no other means of knowledge other than reason. We don't get revelations. We have to use our minds in order to thrive and survive. And the second is that only individuals can do that. That is, the individual is the unit of measurement. It's the unit of importance. And that has an implication for morality. That is, it's the individual happiness that's what matters. It's individual success that what matters. And so capitalism rests on epistemology of reason and a morality of self-interest. Your life is yours. And as the founders of the Declaration of Independence wrote in the Declaration of Independence, you have an inalienable right to pursue your own happiness. So self-interest and reason. Now, what is the modern academic intellectual attitude towards reason and self-interest? Well, reason is ridiculed. The postmodernists tell us there's no such thing as truth, that there is no such thing as reality, that we can't know anything, that we can't solve problems, we're just delusional anyway, that reality is, that nature's too complicated for us to deal with anyway, that we're just puny little things that don't matter. Our academic institutions also tell us that we're not individuals. Individuals are just cogs in a machine. We're a collective. We have a collective consciousness. You might have noticed that thing floating above all of us. That's the collective consciousness of the people in this room. Right? And if you can't see it, sorry, you just don't have the secret sauce. I'm kidding, for those of you who don't know me. So we're taught that there's no such thing as the individual. All there is the collective. And indeed, the pursuit of happiness is, how do they say it? Selfish. And we all know in the popular culture what selfishness means. It means, lying, cheating, stealing, SOB. It means exploiting other people in order to get your way. It means doing whatever's necessary. It means being a horrible human being. So self-interest is out. You're supposed to sacrifice. You're supposed to live for the group. You're supposed to take care of your fellow man. The common good is what's important. Social well-being is what's important. The individual doesn't matter. The community matters, and you are supposed to sacrifice for the community. And reason is out, right? Reason is out. If you're religious, then religion is in, and if you're not religion, then emotion are in. That's all there is. Religion, emotion, mysticism, religion, and reason. And they've thrown out reasons. All we have is emotions and mysticism. And since God doesn't exist, all you're left with is emotions. That's it. So we live in a society that is enamored with emotions. We teach our kids to feel. We teach our kids to express themselves. They don't know anything. There's nothing to express. Who the hell cares what a 5-year-old thinks about anything? With all due respect to 5-year-olds. Emotions are not tools of cognition. They're not what matters. So capitalism rests on this foundation of individualism, pursuit of individual happiness, and on reason. And that foundation is gone. It just doesn't exist. So to the extent that capitalism still survives in the world, it survives by inertia. It survives without a base. It's a floating thing. And any little poke, anytime you poke it, it collapses. It gives up. Nobody defends it, because who's going to defend self-interest? Ayn Rand and Ayn Rand. Who's going to defend reason, right? Almost nobody. So there just isn't, the philosophical foundations are being left undefended, and therefore the system is just, nobody understands it, nobody gets it. Our professors who teach economics don't even understand it anymore. Certainly nobody who teaches politics understands it. Nobody can justify it, because it purports to stand on this base that is that modern society, modern philosophy is rejected completely. I'm
picking up on your comments about the modern intellectual zeitgeist and university teaching, but this stretches all the way through secondary, primary. Not merely is it a collectivist impulse that every student is browbeaten into, but something more serious and I would suggest at least as dangerous, which is an anti-human impulse as well. They swing between the modern intellectual, something like a human being isn't particularly special, they're just a slightly more intelligent chimpanzee. There is this continuum of intelligence from the cockroach through to the dog, through to the chimpanzee, and then humans are just the next point on the graph if you were drawing an exponential of compute power or something of the hardware. But it's simply not true. We are categorically different. As Yaron was saying, we are not driven, pre-programmed by our genes. Of course we have genes, but we are not condemned to obey our base instincts. We have ideas or memes. We can fly free of our genetic impulses. And people do this all the time. If there's a gene for anything, it's a gene for survival, or there's a gene for eating. But everyone knows the impulse of going on a diet. And in evil situations, people know of situations where you have suicide bombers. So we can fly free of these genetic impulses. But not only are people regarded as just a little bit more intelligent kind of ape, but worse than that people are a virus. So on the one hand, we are just a slightly more intelligent ape, nothing particularly special. But on the other hand, we are uniquely destructive. Now, if we are uniquely destructive, and let's give the people credit who say that, where does this unique capacity for destruction come from? It comes from great power and wealth, and where does that come from? Well, it comes from our capacity to do the thing that no other creature has ever been able to do on this planet. Generate grand explanatory theories about anything, absolutely anything. The phenomenal thing about this human mind is it begins to reflect the rest of physical reality. We can point telescopes to the other side of the universe, essentially, and detect these things called quasars, quasi-stellar radio sources, things that look a little bit like a star. And we can figure out what those things are. Black holes that are absorbing material into them and shining brighter than many, many galaxies. Inside of our minds, we can build a model that over time comes to resemble the physical reality there on the other side of the universe about an event that happened billions of light years away, billions of years ago. This is a phenomenal fact about what human beings are that no chimpanzee or dog or cockroach even approximates. And that capacity not only allows us to generate knowledge, but the knowledge allows us to generate wealth. And wealth, defined non-parochially, is something like the repertoire of physical transformations we are able to enact, which means the amount of things we're able to do. We might have the idea that we want to, let's say, go to Mars. We might have the theoretical basis about how to go to Mars, but we might lack the wealth. We might not have the resources yet to do it, and so we need to generate the wealth to do that. Wealth generation is at the heart of how it is that we make progress in an enlightened society. Many other societies have almost become enlightened over time, but have fallen by the wayside. Athens is a good case in point. What happened to Athens? There was a flourishing for a time, a tradition of criticism where people were arguing with each other about how to improve ideas in that society. Then things went wrong. We can draw a bright line between places that tend in the direction of wanting to improve their ideas and other societies that want to remain in stasis, stagnation, who adhere, for example, to a holy book, who adhere to a political doctrine, and do not want things to change there. And so therefore, you can't have free speech in such societies, you can't have democracy in such societies, because anything that challenges the status quo would immediately lead to an enlightened society such as ours. And these are the genuine enemies that we're encountering at the moment. And so I say we were going to talk about more than just capitalism here, and so it might be a useful point at which, given we are in Sydney and given we're in Australia, we're just having great problems at the moment finding political clarity on the issue of the one democracy, the one shining beacon of the Enlightenment that exists at the moment in the Middle East, in that part of the world. And yet, for some reason, our political leaders have become incapable of standing up and supporting Israel against the forces of stasis, stagnation, violence, death, and poverty. Can you explain, I'll throw this to you, Ron, first. Can you explain why is it that in a place like Australia, which is an otherwise beacon of democracy and progress and so on and so forth, nonetheless still have our so-called intellectuals especially, but our political leaders can't find it within themselves to stand up in front of the population of Australia and say, we are on the side of Israel and to hell with Hamas, Hezbollah, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Australia is unique in this case. I think this is common throughout the Western world. The United States may be a small exception, but even there, not consistently. But certainly the entire Western world, the entire set of countries that one would consider relatively free democratic societies, liberal democracies, are all basically unwilling to stand up and unequivocally side with Israel when Israel deserves their unequivocal support. And I think the reason for that is simple. We really can't even stand up for our own system, right? We have no understanding of why our system is good, why our system is right, what is good about Australia, what is good about the West, what is good about the Enlightenment, what is good about capitalism. We have no willingness to defend any of those things. Why would we be willing to defend it on the other side of the planet in the Middle East of all places? And in addition, what is happening in the Middle East is a complete expression of kind of the ideology we've been taught. So I said capitalism is kind of this floating thing. It's lost its mooring intellectually. What are the intellectuals telling us about the Middle East? What are they telling us about life more broadly? Well, they're telling us that if you're successful, and if you've done great in life, and if you've achieved a lot, then somehow you're bad. You've exploited other people, obviously. You're the oppressor, and you really need to apologize. And if you're a failure, and if you've not succeeded, and particularly if you belong to a group that maybe in the very distant past or in the less distant past were oppressed, then you obviously are the one being exploited, you're being oppressed, and these successful people should be sacrificed for your sake so that you can be pulled up and they can be pulled down. And the ideal, ultimately, for all of these people is somehow equal outcome. An egalitarian vision of the world. Not egalitarianism in a sense of political equality, but in a sense of equality of outcome, equality of how we all end up. So if you're successful, you're guilty. If you're a failure, you're virtuous. You must have been done, you're the good guy. We must sacrifice the able to the so-called virtuous. Now think about this in the context of the Middle East. Before 1967, Israel was a country filled with pathetic, poor, failed, barely surviving Jews, right? They just survived the Holocaust. They had this tiny little country. Nobody believed they'd survive a decade. Nobody believed they could thrive in this desert surrounded by enemies. Everybody loved Israel. I'm sure Australia loved Israel. Europe loved Israel. The only people who were so-so in Israel were the Americans. They didn't, there was an actual arms embargo between 1947 and 1967 on Israel by the American administrations. And then 1967 happened. 1967, for those of you who don't know, there was a war called the Six-Day War in which Israel was attacked by basically 7 Arab countries and Israel wiped them out. Destroyed them in 6 days. 6 days. Completely shocking the world. And suddenly, the world looked around and said, these Jews are strong. They're capable. They're rich, they're successful. They obviously must be the bad guys. Now let's look for somebody who's suffering and miserable. Who did they exploit? They must have exploited somebody, because you can't get rich without exploiting people. Oh, Palestinians. They must be the victim. They're poor, they're suffering. And Europe flipped completely from being Israel's best friend to being the Palestinians' best friend and rejecting Israel completely. Nobody cared about the Palestinians before 1967. Nobody. Suddenly, they became the cause of the entire global left. So, altruism, Ayn Rand identifies this morality of altruism. Altruism is a morality that basically has been with us since the birth of Christianity. It's the idea that your moral purpose in life is to sacrifice for those who don't have it as good as you. The purpose in life is to help others, but not to help yourself. Helping yourself is selfish, and we know that's bad. No mother has ever taught their kids to be selfish. You're supposed to be selfless. So there's this morality that says be selfless, sacrifice. And when you meet somebody, Immanuel Kant and Auguste Comte, the French philosopher, both said something very similar. They said if you meet somebody who's happy, successful, rich, done well in life, don't trust them, because they must have been selfish. You can't achieve any of those things without being self-interested, without pursuing your own values. You can't trust people like that. The only people you can trust are the poor and the suffering. This goes back to Christianity, the meek shall inherit the earth. They have not exploited anybody. They have not taken advantage of anybody. They've not been self-interested, otherwise they wouldn't be so poor. So they are the virtuous. And today, in modern society, we've got something called, in modern race theory or modern academic theory, we've got something called intersectionality, where we look at any individual, we choose an individual, and we look at all their different characteristics, and we determine how oppressed the particular characteristic is in society. So if you've got a certain skin color, if it's white, well, you're not oppressed, you're the oppressor. If you're black, you've been oppressed. If you're gay, you've been oppressed. If you're heterosexual, you're not. And you add up, everybody gets a score, right? And the more oppressed you are, the more we love you. And the more unoppressed you are, the more successful you are, the more we hate you. And the Israeli-Palestinian whole issue fits perfectly into that. How can we defend, how can we argue for a country that is so technologically advanced and sophisticated as Israel, and as rich as Israel is? We can't defend that. And their enemy are these poor, miserable Palestinians. I mean, your heart goes to the poor and miserable. You can't defend the rich and successful. It goes against everything we are taught at our universities. It goes against our moral code that we've held for 2,000 years. And so it's not surprising at all. Again, what we need to reestablish in the West are the pillars: reason, self-interest. Those are the pillars that established where we are today. Once you take those pillars away, all hell breaks loose. And what we see today in the world is all hell breaking loose.
Nikos, picking up on what Yaron has said there is a move, a sense within the United States anyway, and perhaps elsewhere around the world, of isolationism, of wanting to retreat from defending the deepest values of the Enlightenment, wherever they might manifest themselves. Israel is one example, the Ukraine's another example. People are talking about, well, let's just defend our own borders. What's wrong with that? How do we criticise this impulse from nationalists, conservatives who say, why should we be wasting our tax dollars? Why should we be sending our troops to die somewhere else outside of our borders where it's not really our interests?
Within a context, every single thing that you said could be defensible. Why should we send indeed our soldiers to fight in wars that are not ours? Why should indeed get involved with campaigns that have nothing to do with our national interest? Notice something though. When they talk about, for example, you mentioned conservatives. Let's call it the MAGA right, the new right, the woke right, however you want to call it. They don't just tell you, we have no interest in sending, let's say, money or weapons to Ukraine. They also take one more step. They're telling you that Ukraine is a money laundering operation, that Zelensky is a cokehead, and they're also telling you that Putin is misunderstood. They're also telling you that Russia is based, and Russia is, Tucker told us, it has cheap supermarkets and so on and so forth. Now, what is this showing me? It shows me that these people, the way they operate, the way their mind works or not works, is completely destroyed. Their guiding principle is not viewing reality, saying, well, let's see that conflict, what is happening, where does our interest lie? Their mode of operation is a bug in their mind called tribalism. Tribalism, to put it simply, means I judge the world based on what is my group and my party line. For example, the obvious one is, let's say, the double standards. You see, example, Obama, you remember when Obama went to Cuba? What did the conservatives say? Treason. How dare you shake the hands of a dictator? Remember when Trump had the bromance with Kim Jong-un? 4D chess. He's the new Clausewitz. This is tribalism. But now we have an even worse kind of tribalism, which is, let's see what the group we hate does, and let's do the opposite. Which means, what do the woke left establishment do? They like Zelensky and they hate Putin. Therefore, I'm with Putin. And people, this is not a joke because, I mean, these people are a joke, but this is serious because it can get very, very, very dark. If you're on Twitter, have you noticed lately many people who claim that not only Putin, but also Hitler is misunderstood? Hitler is everywhere on Twitter. Hitler is everywhere on TikTok. What is this if not the final stage of tribalism, which is, again, contrarianism? I have zero idea what I stand for, but I know what I stand against. Whatever the other side stands for, I stand against. And the end of that road is simple nihilism, which means I stand for nothing. And actually, because some people stand for something, I just want to destroy. I don't think that these people even care about Putin or care about Russia. They just hate what their country stands for or what the other side stands for. It's all a mess in their head. So they're not after anything. So we could say isolationism, there is something healthy perhaps in it within a context, but how these people use it, it's completely unhealthy. It's tribalism, and tribalism makes you stupid. Literally, it's a virus of the way you're thinking.
And I want to put on one other element that's less, in a sense, negative. That is, it's not just reactionary. There is a problem, right? So one of the challenges that the right has today, the conservatives have today, is if we've given up on reason and individualism, which used to be kind of somewhat vaguely understood as the basis for Western civilization. They kind of understood that the Enlightenment was the basis of Western civilization. But now they've come to the conclusion the Enlightenment is actually bad. The Enlightenment led to leftism. The Enlightenment led to woke. So we're against the Enlightenment. So what is Western civilization then? What are we standing for? What is the positive? How can we defend America? How can we defend our national interest, our nationalism? And here I think they have a positive program. So, and they have to, if they can't go to the Enlightenment, if they can't go to reason and individualism, then where do they go? Well, then they have to go to collectivism and to faith, the opposite of reason. And here you're seeing a rise in America, and I don't know if this is true in Australia, but certainly in America, of a Christian nationalism. A collectivism that is based on Christianity. A rejection of reason and the whole Enlightenment project. Wholeheartedly, they hate the Enlightenment. I mean, one of the commentators on the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's channel, says 1220. Wants to go back to 1220. I mean, I don't know if you guys know anything about life in 1220, but nobody wants to go back to life in 1220, right? But that's the idea. And he says, no, not materially, as if you can separate these out. Culturally, I want the culture of 1220, but an iPhone. I don't have the heart to tell him that's impossible, right? The iPhone is a creation of the culture that's exact opposite of 1220. So they want their Christianity and they want their collectivism. And then when they look at the world, so take Ukraine for example, they look at the world and they see Ukraine versus Putin. And what they see is Ukraine in some vague sense representing enlightenment. They're supported by Europe, which supposedly is representing enlightenment, not so much, but you know, in their simple mind it seems that way. And then they see Putin. Putin's a man's man. He rides around on horses without a shirt, right? He's like a warrior from the Bronze Age, ready to go out there and fight. He's a knight from the 12th century, from the 13th century, 1220, perfect. He's a Christian Orthodox. He tells you he's a Christian. He doesn't hide it. The Roman Christian, the Russian Christian church plays a huge role in Russian politics, and he's proud of it. He hates gays. Like, that's huge for the American right. The American right would love to hate gays, but they can't. They feel like they can't actually say it because the American public has shifted so far to accepting gays. But Putin says it, and they love that. They love that. And every speech Putin gives, he goes after LGBTQ, he goes after trans, he goes after all these issues because he knows that he's saying the things that the American right believes but cannot say. And they love him for it. So it's not just contrarian. I agree with Nikos. It's a tribalism. But the people at the top, the people who are leading the tribe, the Jordan Petersons of the world, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, they're not just contrarians. They actually have an agenda. And their agenda is this Christian nationalism. Their agenda is a rejection of reason and elevation of faith, and a rejection of individualism and elevation of collectivism. And that is what is driving their attitude. And it's an ugly form of nationalism. You could imagine saying, look, America's a free country. We're not sending troops to fight for other countries. We're going to protect our freedom because we believe in these ideals, and the reality is Europe is far away from these ideals, and maybe Israel's not even on those ideals. So we're going to stick to. Okay, you could argue with that, but that is based on something. But no, they actually have a positive vision, which is a really, really nasty positive vision, where America is a beacon of this new nationalist movement, and they love Orban, and they love Putin, and Trump secretly loves Xi. We know he has a bromance with a brutal dictator of North Korea, so we know those relationships are there. They want authoritarianism. They're eager for authoritarianism. They're rejecting everything about true freedom.
Tribalism, isolationism, and protectionism is another aspect to this as well, where one of my favourite shorthand four-word quips that describe the power of capitalism is concentrated losses, dispersed gains. And we have this in Australia in spades. We don't have much, if any, of an automobile industry anymore. There's no cars being manufactured here. Holden went bust completely. But before they did, the government did everything it could, despite the fact that it had allowed the unions to become extremely powerful. Wages went up. The companies couldn't afford to pay the wages of the employees anymore. So the car companies were going bankrupt. But before they did, the government was throwing millions upon millions of dollars to try and protect that industry, the very industry that they destroyed. A similar thing is now happening in the United States, and the response there appears to be Trump's favourite word that he says, which is tariffs. Tariffs are going to solve all that. Tariffs are going to protect the concentrated losses. Never mind the dispersed gains that everyone will experience if we get cheap imports from China. But is there a point at which we say China are actually strategic enemies, and perhaps trading with them is enriching them, and perhaps that is a threat to us? Is there any merit to that kind of argument?
Yeah, so before we get to China, I have to say, one of the stupidest manifestations of nationalism, I mean really stupidest, dumb in terms of dumb and moronic, is this idea of rejection of free trade. We have a 250-year history with this, going back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, 250 years ago basically, explaining why free trade is good, explaining why mercantilism is bad. And we have now had 250 years of proof that Adam Smith was 100% right. There is literally no economic argument against free trade. None. Zero. Tariffs are universally, across economists, understood as the stupidest tax in the world. There just is nothing, nowhere in the economic literature, in any economist, good economist, mediocre economist, bad economist, right? So one issue, there are two issues in economics everybody agrees upon, right? Left, middle, and right. Rent control never works, always is bad, and tariffs never work, they're always bad. That's it. That's the only two things any economists agree about. And it's made a comeback, not in the name of economics, but in the name of tribalism and in the name of nationalism, in the name of rejection of reason. If you want an example of the rejection of reason, tariffs are it. And if you want an embodiment of an anti-reason person who has no is too gracious, no understanding of economics, it's Donald Trump. And the best illustration of this was over the weekend. And now, he didn't say anything new, but he said it again after he's been saying it for 8 years. He said over the weekend that we the Americans, subsidize the Canadians because we have a trade deficit with them. Now, that's just economic ignorance. There's no subsidy there. I have a trade deficit with the grocery store. Huge. I buy groceries from them all the time and leave them my cash. They never, ever, ever have hired me to come and give a talk. They've never used that cash to hire me to come in there. And yet the trade deficit continues and continues and continues. There's no end to it. And indeed, it will never end. There is zero wrong with trade deficits, other things held equal. Nothing wrong with trade deficits. They are an expression of, your relative strengths. Some countries, produce certain things. Other countries produce other things. And one of the things that America produces is a great investment environment. So everybody in the world wants dollars. Sell America stuff to get the dollars. And then they use the dollars to invest them in America. If America is such a loser, why would anybody want a dollar? If America is such a loser, why would anybody want to invest in America? Trade deficits are a sign of strength, not of weakness. They're a sign everybody wants your currency. Everybody wants to invest in your bonds. Everybody wants to buy your stuff, to buy your assets, your financial assets. That's a huge expression of strength, not weakness. It's certainly no subsidy. And the reality is that close to 90%, I think it's 87% of all the jobs lost in manufacturing. Do you guys know how much the United States manufactures today as compared to the past? Manufactures stuff, more than ever. You never hear that on the news, right? The United States today manufactures the most it's ever manufactured in its history, with something like a quarter of the people, a lot less people. So where have the manufacturing jobs gone? Not to China, not to Mexico. 87% of the jobs have gone to automation, to increase productivity. And yet increased productivity is the whole point of having an effective economy. It's how wages go up. And there's a reason, by the way, the United States has outperformed every single economy in the world over the last 15 years by huge margins. Because the United States increases productivity, the rest of the world does not. You've stagnated productivity-wise. So the ignorance in the name of tribalism is stunning. And yet nobody calls them on it because of the tribalism. Because they're on my side and they're against the left. I can't criticize Trump. God forbid I criticize Trump. Trump's one of the good guys. He's not a leftist, so he must be a good guy, right? So, but the ignorance is astounding. Now, what was the question? Do you remember?
No, I don't.
Do you remember? No.
It was about the argument against trading with China.
Yeah, so now China. So China's an interesting case. So let's assume that China, not assume, it's a fact that China is, I guess because of a lot of things the United States has done and China's done, China has become a strategic challenge to the United States militarily. Put aside, there's no such thing as an economic enemy. There's no such thing as an economic challenge. You want other countries to get rich. It benefits the United States for China to be successful economically. The better off China is economically, the better off the United States is economically. Why? Because you trade. How does trade work? Who loses in a trade? I hate to tell you, but nobody. When I buy an iPhone for $1,000, who lost? Nobody. I gained something worth more than $1,000 for me. There's the iPhone. It's going to come out. Yeah. Good. Here it is. I gained because this is worth more than $1,000 to me, and Apple gained. Win-win. So trade, by its fundamental nature, this is economics, the very foundation of economics. There's no economics without this. Trade is a win-win relationship, at least in intention. Otherwise, you don't enter the trade. You walk home. So when an American trades with a Chinese, it's win-win. Both parties are winning. Now, so there's no economic threat. There's a military threat. Now, let's say China's a real military threat to the United States. Tariffs don't solve anything. What should you do? Well, step one, amazingly, the Biden administration took, which Trump never did, but Biden did. Biden has been tougher on China than Trump ever was. And I'm not a fan of Biden. Biden's awful, horrible. But on this, he was good. And that is, you stop selling them sophisticated equipment. You stop selling them sophisticated chips. You stop selling them equipment to make the chips. You tell TSMC in Taiwan, you cannot sell to China your most sophisticated chips, and they don't. You tell ASML in the Netherlands, you can't sell the equipment. You tell the Japanese, you can't sell the equipment, and they don't, because you form alliances. So you starve China from the most advanced technologies. And you can do that for a while. I don't think it works long term, but in the short run, it works. And that's about it. Now, let's say China's a real enemy. Let's say China is about to invade the United States. So it's a real threat. It's an existential threat today. What should you do? Tariffs? Tax your own people because China's a threat? That's bizarre. That's nutty. What you should do is stop trading with them. That is, embargo them. It's what we do with North Korea. It's what we do with Iran. It's sanctions, which means no trading, zero trade. Because trade is win-win. You don't want the Chinese to win, because if the Chinese win, they'll attack you. They'll have enough wealth to attack you. So you've now declared them a strategic enemy, an imminent threat to the individual rights of Americans, and you stop all trade with China. And that's what you can do. You can stop them from getting sensitive equipment, stuff to build weapons, and you can embargo them. Tariffs only penalizes your people. Penalizes China a little bit as well, but it primarily penalizes your people. And it doesn't stop China from manufacturing those goods. They send them to other places. They ship them through Vietnam. They still get to the United States. And by the way, what happens when you have tariffs, which nobody talks about, this basic economics. What happens to the currency when you have tariffs? So if the United States imposed 100% tariff on China, what would happen to the dollar-yuan relationship? Would the dollar get stronger or weaker? It would get much stronger. It would get stronger because the Chinese would start buying dollars, because they still want to invest in the US. They can't sell us stuff anymore because of the tariffs are blocked, so they start buying dollars, which drives up the price of the dollar and drives down the price of yuan, which makes Chinese goods more expensive or less expensive for the Americans? Less expensive. So you might have a tariff, but the goods are cheaper because of your currency. So what happens is currency changes wipe out the effect, not all of it, not 100%, but 50, 60, 70% of the effect of tariffs anyway. One of the reasons the dollar has been so strong over the last few months is the expectation Trump will win and tariffs will rise, and the expectation the demand for dollars will increase across the world as a consequence of the tariffs. So again, economics is not one of the things, everybody should read this wonderful book written a long time ago called Economics in One Lesson. It's the best book on economics ever written. Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And one of the first thing he says in the first chapter is economics is about secondary and third level and fourth level effects. And you don't understand anything until you understand the second and third and fourth level effects. And the theme across the entire book is something called the broken window fallacy. And we can talk about what the broken window fallacy is, but that is the theme across the entire book, and almost all of these are broken window fallacies. The whole idea of tariffs and everything else. So anyway, it's just, if you want to deal with China, deal with China. Right? Deal with China. And you have to be an adult about it. Tariffs a 3-year-old's tantrum about China. They're not actually a way of dealing with China.
Nikos, anti-capitalism is its own thing, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's often finds fellow travellers in anti-Semitism, for example. David Deutsch, physicist and philosopher, has identified something he refers to as the pattern, which is the tendency to legitimise the hurting of Jews. And this is why pogroms tend to not appear in a cyclical nature, but they do appear now and again, regularly. And people who tend to be anti-capitalist also tend to be the keffiyeh wearing, Palestine flag waving, anti-Semites that we see protesting against Israel. And also, and I think you've done a talk recently about this, anti-capitalism finds fellow travellers with anti-Americans. And so why is it that we have this unholy alliance of hatreds towards trade as well as Americans and Jews?
I would know something about this because I was an anti-Semite, an anti-American, and an anti-capitalism. So,
In your youth.
oh yeah, not like yesterday, yeah. In my youth. So notice something very interesting. If we were to take the left at its word, the left should be full on the side of Israel. Because on the other side, you have some people who, we saw what they did to Israeli women, so you could expect that that's how they treat their own women. We have on the other side some people who think that if you're gay, your position is to hang from a crane. And we also have people who are openly racist, with the oldest racism of the world, which is anti-Semitism. So perhaps the one silver lining of this holy alliance that we see today, and the best example is this being called Greta Thunberg, which started as the poster girl of environmentalism, and now she's the poster girl of jihadism. And at the end of the day, they're all against the same things. And it doesn't even start with today's left. It starts with Marx himself. And unfortunately, Marx has this very notorious essay called On the Jewish Question, which is full of anti-Semitic rants. And people focus on the anti-Semitic rants and don't realize that Marx is not actually attacking the Jews. He's attacking the idea of the self-interested, rational individual. He's attacking the idea of the bourgeois. And what he's saying is the bourgeoisie, which for him means the self-interested individual, is so bad as the worst kind of human beings, which we know is the Jew. So why do the people who hate capitalism also hate the United States, also hate Israel? Because these things are based on the same values. The left thinks that we cannot think as individuals. And here you have the country of individualism, the United States. The left thinks that we have, as you actually said earlier, the left believes that if you are somehow a post-colonial subject, anything goes. We cannot criticize you. Therefore, you can be a Palestinian, commit all types of atrocities, and we cannot even judge you. Notice the left not being able to judge. They judge us all the time about us racist, sexist, homophobic. But when it comes to people who slaughter families in front of their children, suddenly we cannot judge. So at the end of the day, there are two levels. The one, and again, I'm judging from my older self. The one level is there's something very, very dark inside you. There's something very, very envious. Because it's not, let's not give them the benefit of the doubt that they actually care about the Palestinians. If you care about the Palestinians, you don't want them to live under Hamas. If you care about the Palestinians, you go to the UN and to every stupid government who wants a Palestinian state and you tell them, for God's sake, don't do it. A Palestinian state means that, just like that, legitimately every Palestinian lives under Hamas. So there must be something very dark in your soul if you actually support these people. So the one level is the level of envy, what Ayn Rand called hatred of the good for being the good. The United States is successful and rich, therefore we hate it. And the second level, why they hate these countries, is because most of these people are what Ayn Rand would call second-handers, which means they have absorbed every banal, stupid bromide that their professors have fed them with. They view themselves as radicals and as edgy, and they share every single opinion that their parents or their professors or their teachers shared to them. From the very simple thing which says that if you're weak, you're good. I mean, my parents told me that. Therefore, the Palestinians are weak, they have to be good. To the, I don't want to say a bad word, but to the other monstrosity that if you're white, because this also plays a role. So, by the way, I think a big part of it is not old-style antisemitism. These people didn't start by hating the Jews. They started by hating the successful, rich, white country. Why? Because every time in the university, they've been told that the white is the colonizer, that the white is the one who is to blame for the fate of these people. And again, notice how this is dehumanizing for the quote post-colonial subject themselves. It's like telling them, you have no agency. There are countries that the white man has left for decades. There are countries that the white man was there for some decades, and throughout their history, because of their ideas or the culture, or we can discuss this, they have had all sorts of problems, but it's always the blame of someone else. Again, if you have a friend and he's drinking, if you tell him it's someone else's fault, you don't really care about that person. So more and more I'm convinced that the left is motivated by envy and not by sympathy for the suffering. I have sympathy for the suffering. I care about innocent Palestinians more than all these people who were at the opera protesting together. And that's why I'm with Israel.
Subtly changing the topic, but still revolving around this dehumanization idea, is that we mentioned Greta Thunberg, and okay, so now she's chief jihadi of that particular movement. She began as an environmentalist. I don't think it's any accident that environmentalism, looked at closely, is a deeply anti-human movement in its modern manifestation. And we suffer here in Australia a particular version of the malady because it is so perverse that we sit atop some of the greatest resources, largest stores of coal, pitchblende, uranium ore, but what do we do with most of it? We send it to China and we send it to India, we send it to anywhere else except use it here. It was only a week or two ago where everyone here would know, if you're a Sydney-sider, there were threats, according to our Premier, of there being brownouts and blackouts here in Sydney because it was a warm day. It wasn't a particularly hot day, it got into the mid to high 30s, but we were told, don't run your washing machine, don't turn on your pool filter, for fear that we were going to have a blackout. And so in order to skirt around that, by the way, large factories were told, shut down, so that we can preserve the limited amount of electricity we do have. The few coal-fired power stations we have, they're planned for decommission. The one side of politics says, the best we can offer you is, we're going to give you nuclear energy 5-10 years from now. Okay, great. The other side is saying, we're going to stick with wind and solar and batteries. But we know how that's going at the moment. We're already being warned about blackouts. No one is talking about exploiting the coal that's already here, perhaps building a few more coal-fired power stations to tide us over until such time as fusion energy comes along or whatever the next thing is. Obviously, we know that these fossil fuels are finite. Ultimately, we have to move to something else. But at the moment, is there any reason to impoverish ourselves and to try and save the planet while a place such as China is building, I think the last figure I saw, was it 2 per week, or was it 1 every 2 weeks, coal-fired power stations? And we won't build 1 every year in order to pull up the slack to enable us, to enable our industries to flourish, and perhaps more importantly, to allow the individual household to have a severe cut in the cost of energy. Because at the moment, Australia is paying, I think one of the few countries that pays more is perhaps the United Kingdom. But we have amongst the highest energy costs on the planet.
Germany, I think.
Okay. But how absurd. We sit atop, as I say, some of the largest reserves of coal and uranium. What explains these energy policies that are going on?
Can I say something quickly, and then I'll leave it to Yaron? I'll just stand up because I can't sit for long. So you said something which people might think is a very harsh statement. You said they're anti-humanist, and you're 100% right. And here's the moment I realized it. It was when I discussed with an environmentalist about the issue of plastic straws. I don't know about this country, but in Europe, there's a huge, plastic straws are basically banned. Of course, the authorities don't know that in my home I have stocked plastic straws because I want to drink my Greek frappes. But here's the interesting thing. I said to that environmentalist, there has been some research which shows that the percentage of the plastic in the ocean which comes from plastic straws is 0.02%. 0.02%. Why do you pour all this energy in this campaign for an issue which is a non-issue? If you, as you say, you care about pollution and things like that, why then don't you deal with more important issues, but you deal with that one topic? And after I pushed and I pushed and I pushed, do you know what was his final line of defense? Because he said, by banning straws, at least we're doing something. People, what does it mean, at least we're doing something? It means at least you are giving up something. So for them, the goal is for you to sacrifice something, for you to let go of something, for you to give up for something. That's the anti-humanist. The human being gives up something. So great lessons from the plastic straw. And that's why I'll go to the barricades, actually, for the plastic straw. Because it's such a nice thing, right? Something so small, so simple, and yet it gives us so much joy. Or at least to those of us who enjoy cold beverages.
Don't you want to save the planet you're on?
No. I want to exploit the planet. And I'm serious. That is, the whole environmentalist movement is premised on a falsehood. And the falsehood is that there is some pristine planet out there that, is built in kind of a natural state to inhabit human beings. And if we just don't touch it at all, everything is going to be wonderful. But the reality is that we live on a planet that is trying to constantly kill us. Whether because of the weather, or whether because of wild beasts. I hear the spiders here and the snakes here in Australia, particularly nasty. And we as a being, we're this really unique creature. The only way human beings can survive, the only way we can survive, never mind thrive and be successful, is by changing the environment in which we live. A few of us could live as hunter-gatherers. A few of us. Not many, though. If we're going to grow, if we're going to be successful as a species, we have to, at some point, engage in large-scale hunting. And then it means we have to chop down a lot of trees to build huts. And then it means we're going to discover agriculture and start changing the nature of the land to accommodate, large-scale industrial agriculture. And then we probably want to build stronger homes, which means knocking down mountains and chipping away at them and taking out bricks and building mountains and taking animals' habitats, and who knows what we do with the little snails or whatever. And then go on from there. Every human advancement comes by exploiting nature. I mean, there are only so many molecules or so many atoms in the universe. What human beings do is rearrange them. For what? To make our lives better. To hell with the snails. Who cares? They're just atoms that if we can rearrange to make our lives better, we should. That's how human beings survive. We live on a planet that is just a bunch of resources for us to use in order to live better lives. Now, if you can show me that building a bunch of coal plants destroys human life, then, we can have a discussion about what the alternatives should be. But if the discussion about some vague notion of environmentalism or about habitats or about something unrelated to human life, it's irrelevant. But the environmentalist movement doesn't care about human beings. It's not built about preserving human life. It believes that there's some intrinsic value, some external value, some value that goes beyond what human beings value in nature as it is and as it always has been. And that is what they want to preserve. And that means excluding human beings, because that's not how we survive. We survive by exploiting our environment. We survive by changing the environment. And we need to be careful not to do things that are self-destructive. Absolutely. We don't want to self-destruct. But we're actually pretty good at that. And I don't think we are doing that. If you take out the environmentalist kind of nature as an intrinsic value, nature is good in and of itself, there are very few things human beings do that is actually destructive to ourselves that we can't handle fairly easily.
Planet Earth is an absolute death trap. It is not a hospitable place. Any one of us left outside of modern technology, modern homes, modern clothing, are going to either die of heat exhaustion or exposure to the cold. We're going to die of starvation. We're going to catch a disease from unfiltered water. 99.99% of species that have ever existed have gone extinct. If we wish to be the exception, we have to use the one advantage we have, because we don't have strong claws, we don't have big bodies, we can't swim under the water. We have our minds and our reason. And so all of our institutions and our explanations have to protect our ability to generate more knowledge and more rapid progress. We have to continue to accelerate. We were talking earlier about how there is a movement now for acceleration. And I'm on the side of the accelerationists so long as they're against the pessimists. The pessimists, who include generally people who are prophets. Prophets are people who are going to tell you about all the ways that human beings are going to go extinct because of their own actions. They're going to go extinct because the next virus is going to overrun us. We're going to create artificial superintelligence that's going to attack us. We're going to wipe out each other with nuclear weapons. The climate is going to destroy us. Ask a scientist and they will tell you the way in which they think humanity is going to either kill itself or to wipe itself out because of its own stupidity. So we don't want to be one of those other 99.9% of species that go extinct, because that is the rule. And the reason that's the rule is because the Earth is not hospitable. It is a death trap, as I say. Now, we have about 15 minutes left, so should we ask for questions from the audience?
There's one. Shut up. Yeah, stand up.
Hello guys, thank you so much for coming here. You touched on the subject of foreign policy and isolationism, and you talked a little bit about what's wrong with the left and the right approach. I wanted to ask a little bit about what you guys think in principle about how to approach the topic. So, foreign policy often characterized as a spectrum between idealism and realism. Policies of the former camp aim to preserve and extend the liberal international order, presented as a principled stance against autocracy. Principled in contrast to the selfish position of the realists, who are willing to compromise with evil to avoid confrontation. Principled and altruistic versus pragmatic and selfish. Recognizing the mistake in taking on the selfless responsibility of world peace, and also the mistake in legitimizing autocrats of the anti-West axis. What is the Objectivist approach to foreign policy, and how does it address this full dichotomy? Thank you so much.
He's written a book, so that's read.
So I reject the whole way in which people look at foreign policy. So like in many realms of philosophy, where people are dualists, they have two, idealism versus realism. I reject both of them, right? I believe in a self-interested foreign policy, and in a principled, if you will, idealistic, but not in the sense of idealism, foreign policy. So I'm going to use the United States as the example because it is the superpower, one way or the other, and it's the only foreign policy that really matters is the U.S. The U.S. foreign policy should be 100% self-interested, but not in the realist sense, because I don't think the realists are self-interested. The realists are pragmatic, which means short-term, with no principles. But self-interest requires principles, and requires you to think long-term. So what the United States should think, whoever's in charge of foreign policy should sit down and say, okay, what are the long-term interests of the United States? And what is the role of government in those long-term interests? And there's only one purpose for government, and that is the protection of individual rights. But what is a threat to individual rights? Countries stealing our stuff and killing our people. That's it. So now let's devise a foreign policy that protects our people from countries that will kill them and countries that are going to steal their stuff. If a country tries to kill our people, we destroy them. That's my foreign policy. If a country tries to steal our stuff, we destroy them. You do that once, and the world starts behaving. And by the way, so for example, Iran took the American embassy in November 4th, 1979. Khomeini, who was rising to power in Iran, they invaded the US embassy and took hostages. 44 American hostages.
No, these were the days.
There was 4 days. I can't remember how many hostages. And Ayn Rand at the time was asked, I think she was asked about a year later, she said, what are the consequences of this? And she said, look, the fact that the United States didn't respond with the full might and force of the United States a day after or days after, we will pay for decades, which is one of the most prophetic things she said. We're still paying for it. Iran is still a thorn at our side. And so the United States should have made it very clear to Khomeini what happens if you take hostages of Americans. You die. And you die quickly and effectively. Well, you die effectively, and dying goes together. Right? If they had done that, the whole Middle East today would be completely different. The whole Middle East would be different. And imagine doing that once or two times. So not only is it, idealistic in a sense of a high principle, but it's also practical. And it's consistent with spreading democracy and freedom in the world, because once people say, whoa, look at America. They're standing up for themselves. And they're fighting, if a bad guy attacks them, they go after them. And they're willing to fight the good fight. We want to be like that. We want to be free. We want to be like those guys. We don't want these wimpy authoritarians who cower before America, and they would all cower before America. So I believe in a self-interested, principled foreign policy that is not isolationist in the way they mean it today, but only intervenes in other countries when those other countries pose a real threat to the United States. But when they intervene, you intervene to destroy and to eliminate the threat, not to build democracies and not to appease them and but to eliminate the threat and come home. And the world would be a different place if we lived under that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Is democracy necessary for protecting individual rights and individualism in there?
Is democracy necessary for protecting individual rights? It depends what you mean by democracy. So if what we mean by democracy is majority rule, then not only is it not necessary, it is actually detrimental. So democracy is an antithesis in its pure form, in the form of majority rule, the antithesis of protecting individual rights. And the best example of this is the most ancient of democracies. This is Nikos' country, Athens, right? The Athenian democracy was a majoritarian democracy. Now, it wasn't a full democracy. Only men could vote, and only men who owned certain properties could vote, and so on. But it's a symbol of democracy. And then there was this guy called Socrates. And this guy Socrates, he would go around Athens, and he would engage in conversations with people, and he was accused of what I'm accused of often, which is corrupting the young, right? And the Athenian people said, corrupting the young, that's bad. We need to silence Socrates. And so they basically, there was a trial and everything, but they basically voted, majority vote, and silence Socrates. The only way to silence Socrates is to kill him. They killed him. No individual rights there. Socrates doesn't have a right to free speech. So democracy and individual rights, those don't go together necessarily. So the idea of the American system of government is, yes, you can vote for certain political leaders, but their job is to protect individual rights. And if they violate individual rights, we have created a division, a checks and balances system where the Supreme Court or one of the other parts of government will stop them. But the key is protection of individual rights, not there's no democracy. So for example, Bill of Rights in America, even if 99.9% of the population want to silence me, they cannot, because we have free speech, right? There's a First Amendment. I cannot be silenced by the government. So you want a system that protects rights. You can probably have various variations of it and different degrees of voting, but the key is the voting is not the essential. We've turned democracy into a god. The voting is not the essential. The protection of rights is the essential. I'll give you one example. Probably the best example of freedom in the 20th century and the early 21st century, it's ended now unfortunately, was Hong Kong. Hong Kong became one of the richest places on planet Earth, higher GDP per capita than America in half the time, less than half the time. It was a place where you had complete freedom of speech. It was a place where property rights were protected. Contract law was protected. I mean, it was unbelievably free. You went there and you felt like, yeah, you could do anything and say anything. You didn't have to ask permission from anybody. And yet they never had a vote. Never had a vote. They were ruled kind of under the British system, and Britain has a vote, but they never had a vote. Now, I don't think that's ideal. I think you have to have a mechanism by which you replace the people who are at the top. But the key thing is the protection of rights. That is the essential. That's what freedom means.
Perfect. I agree with all of that. I have to insert Karl Popper's name at this point because he hasn't come up yet. And Karl Popper pointed out that the reason why Plato, for example, in the Republic argued that we need philosopher kings in order to rule over us because the demos, you people, the great unwashed, cannot possibly be trusted with ruling because you're always going to form a mob and the mob is going to trample the rights of the minority. Correct. But the response to that is not to say, okay, we need philosopher kings. What Popper pointed out was that democracy, properly considered, is a system for not installing the best rulers, not installing the best policies, but in the same way that he viewed science, that you're not going to find the final truth, but rather you're going to find a better explanation by removing the slightly worse explanations. He said of democracy, it is a system for removing rules and rulers when you disagree with them. And so long as systems of government adhere to that principle, that it's quite easy without violence to remove the people that you've installed, then it is a mechanism to help preserve rights. But rights do come first. That's why I began by saying that free speech and free trade, or capitalism, are in a sense logically and morally prior to democracy. And we saw that, for example, where you try and install democracy before you have either of those two things, Iraq, Afghanistan, things go to hell in a handbasket very quickly. And
Russia in the 1990s.
Indeed. And as you yourself pointed out many times very eloquently, the dividing line of the DMZ between North Korea and South Korea was divided initially not along the lines of democracy and anti-democracy, because South Korea was ruled by a military dictatorship, but rather South Korea implemented some small amount of capitalism, some amount of markets there, and that's what caused the ratcheting up of wealth in that country. And meanwhile, North Korea was left behind. Only later did they have a democratic system, a little bit of problem recently, but nonetheless, they are basically one place where we can see the Enlightenment has taken a foothold in that area of the world.
But one of the things that is causing, I think, the West to decline and to disappear is we've lost a respect for individual rights. We've elevated democracy as a god. We elevate democracy above free speech and above. You see that in the UK, where you can tweet and get arrested for a tweet that you make, not a tweet threatening, just a tweet that somebody doesn't like. We've rejected free trade, we've rejected capitalism, but we've elevated democracy, and democracy is just the rule of the mob. Democracy is the majority deciding what to do with the minority. And I have a lot of reasons to oppose philosopher kings. I think Plato's whole epistemology is wrong. He assumes that only philosopher kings know the truth, that common people cannot know the truth, that reason is exclusive. And reason is a method of revelation, not a method of engagement with reality and knowledge. So we all have access to the truth, but we don't always use it, sadly. What we need are principles to protect us. They won't protect us if we all turn around and hate the principles. You need individual rights, you need a Bill of Rights. If everybody turns against the Bill of Rights, it's meaningless. But it's survived in the United States pretty well, in spite of the fact that nobody understands it, and nobody could define individual rights, and nobody will stand by individual rights. So sometimes having an institutional constitution in this case that projects into the future can save you a lot of time. Democracy would undermine it completely.
Can I get your opinion on this idea in Australian culture that every ANZAC Day, when we make the landings, there's always an equivocation between the Turkish soldier and the ANZAC soldier, despite the fact that the Ottoman Empire was evil, Armenian genocide, and they were led by Ataturk, who said, I don't order you to win, I order you to die. And as opposed
that was post Ottomans, Ataturk. But ANZAC, what is ANZAC? Australia, New Zealand, Army Corps. Look, World War I is complicated. It's a stupid war. It's the dumbest war in human history, maybe, because it's not clear what it was fought about. It's absolutely true Australia and New Zealand were better than the Ottomans. But why were Australia and New Zealand there? Why were they even fighting? I think the biggest tragedy in American history is that it came into World War I and participated in World War I, right? Because there was a bunch of Europeans killing each other. Let them have it. I mean, there was no American interest at play, really. And indeed, World War I only just set up World War II, which was even worse. So it's a complicated war. Why were Australia and New Zealand there? Because they were part of the British Empire and felt obligated to participate. Why are the British even there? I mean, if you read history of World War I, the British thought they were fighting for some great cause and it was noble to go to war. God, they changed their mind pretty quickly in the trenches while they were there. It is one of the most horrific wars in human history, and one that is very difficult to understand. Certainly, we should never praise the Ottomans and the Germans and those guys, but it's not like our guys were fighting for some great cause, because it's not clear that there was a cause behind the war. World War II, clear. Fascism versus freedom, no question. Cold War, clear. Communism versus freedom. World War I, the mixed economy of Germany versus the mixed economy of England. Who cares? I mean, you care a little bit. The English were a little bit better, but only a little bit. Not worth dying for.
And also, I'm a bit biased as Greek, but you're not going to convince me, no one can convince me that Ataturk was a better guy than the last sultans who were just, in inertia, and they would let their empire collapse. So even the next day in Turkey was not, in my view, better than the Ottomans. At least from the point of view of a Greek.
Yeah, from the point of view of a Greek, I think that's true.
Or from the point of view of an Armenian.
True.
But
Armenians and Greeks, absolutely.
It's fashionable as well. I mean, it's on a continuum with many other ways in which Aussies tend to be anti-Australian. There's even a question now about, well, Hitler on the one hand was a bad guy, but Churchill, did you listen to what he did in India, for example? What an evil guy. I mean, there's moral confusion about all sorts of history, and it essentially comes down to anti-Enlightenment, anti-Western impulses that people have. And so this might not be the perfect manifestation of that, but I think it's on a continuum with that kind of hatred of the West.
I think that's right. You want to say something about Churchill?
No.
Churchill was a good guy, just so you know. Just to be clear.
But it's also an example of what we were saying earlier about contrarianism.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what is the one holy cow that we cannot touch? I mean, negative holy cow, Hitler. Okay, now we're with Hitler. What is the positive holy cow that no one touches? Churchill. Now we're against Churchill. And notice that the left went there first. Remember the summer of 2020 where the BLM protest in London, which statue they were targeting? The statue of Churchill. And what a shame that 4 years later, the people who now target Churchill are the woke of the right.
Any last questions? Yeah.
It's also, I think, the lady. But after, no, you first, and
We can do a few questions. I don't know that we have to stick to the timeline unless we have to. No.
Okay, I have two questions. So, in terms of a market for the creation of intellectual property, do you guys believe in government-enforced patents or not? And the second question is, often in economics, students will be taught that if you raise minimum wages, workers now have more money to spend, and so this raises demand in the economy. This is a logical fallacy. I wonder if you guys can explain why.
So what was the first one? God, I can't hold two thoughts anymore.
So the first was...
I mean, the role of government is to protect property rights, intellectual property rights or property rights. So yes, the government's job is to have a patent office and a whatever copyright office in order to protect property rights in the intellectual realm. If Elon Musk doesn't want to file property rights, he doesn't want to file patents, it's his right. And he can put them in the public domain and everybody can use them. Fine, good for him. But if somebody else wants to hold on to the property they've created, and it's not an idea, it's an manifestation idea in a physical product, then they can file a patent, and the government's job is to protect that patent. I think that is crucial. That is a crucial role of government. The second one was, yeah, of course it's an economic fallacy. There are many fallacies associated with the minimum wage. Minimum wage is a tool to exclude people from the workforce. It's a way to make sure poor people never have a job. Very, very poor people. The poor, the bad. The poor. It affects, young poor people the most. It was initially introduced into the United States. Minimum wages were introduced into the United States to exclude blacks from joining the workforce when they moved north. In the early part of the 20th century, blacks left the South, which was very racist, and moved to the North, where the assumption was they were less racist. And the response of the unions in the North was to lobby for minimum wages so that the wage was higher than the productive value of these new employees who weren't as trained and weren't as productive as existing employees, and price them out of the market. It still prices out of the market mostly black young people or minority young people because they get the worst education and they're the least productive. So it prices them out in terms of it increases, yes, it increases some people's wages, so they have more money to spend, but there are fewer people who have wages because there's fewer employment, so overall it decreases aggregate demand, it doesn't increase aggregate demand, yes.
And also, if a $15 minimum wage makes you richer, why not 50? Why not $100 per hour? So it makes no sense.
Who else? You said
the lady over there.
Okay, so I'm thank you very much for the talk, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm very pessimistic, unfortunately. We've talked about the right-wing Christian collective, but we also have the left-wing woke irrational thinking. And then here we have, which we didn't talk about, the diversity, equity and inclusion movement, which is, as far as I'm concerned, worse than tariffs. And then in the universities now, which are meant to be the bastion of rational thinking, here we have the head of the universities and the student bodies all promoting free Palestine and Gaza, which is reprehensible. How do we bring back rational thinking and self-interest?
I agree it's bad, but it's not as bad as it has been. We still live in the best of times. There are eruptions of irrationality that occur from time to time, and the modern woke movement and DEI and that kind of thing, it's a trend, it's a fad, and you say you're pessimistic. Have the optimism that these things tend to pass. Okay, so fascism took over Germany for a while, but it was defeated. We're nowhere near as bad a situation now as what we were back then. I don't know if people think differently, but the way in which this can change is in the education departments, in the education system. That is a cesspool of these bad ideas. And the indoctrination that happens to people who are learning to be teachers, who then go into the classroom to teach a new generation of people who go off to university and get indoctrinated and then go off into the workforces and fill the corporations and fill governments. It's a big problem. But all I could say is that it won't take much in the way of a change in policy from some people in some places to, let's say, completely eviscerate things like the Federal Education Department. If you could just get rid of that altogether, whether in America or here in Australia, that would go some way, at least, to providing competition within education, to have private or homeschooling or unschooling, to undo some of this indoctrination that's going on that leads to all of those problems that you identified.
So the quick answer is the universities are beyond redemption. I know because I was a professor at the university for 10 years, and that's why I quit and I joined an alternative institution. So if you cannot change an institution, build a parallel power, as the Bolsheviks would put it. What to do, I will leave you the positive what to do, but a first step would be expose what exactly these ideas mean. So what is the destruction they will bring? For example, renewable energy. What would this mean? It would mean that if we implemented it now, billions of people would die or would experience poverty, energy poverty. That's the first step. Billions of people's quality of life would go down and millions of lives would be in danger. So when you have an environmentalist who claim, oh, you know, I care, I'm a good person, you should make explicit that you stand for the misery and perhaps death of millions and millions of people. What type of people? The poorest of the poor of the world. When it comes to DEI, you should go to an owner of a company and make very clear that if you accept this program, you are accepting the premise that your business is not yours. This is what DEI is. This is the main message of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That your business is not yours, and the decisions in your business should not be based on your judgment. It should be based on the latest racist trend that says that you should hire people based on their colors. And you should ask that businesswoman or this businessman, if you are okay with that, then live with DEI. But this is what DEI is about.
So I think that once these crazy ideas are brought into the light, people reject them. They really do. I mean, if you look at DEI right now in the United States, it's in huge retreat. So you guys are about always, 3 to 5 years behind the United States in terms of trends. So just wait a few years and you'll see. But in the United, for example, just give you an example because I read about it yesterday. University of Michigan in the United States had the biggest DEI program in the entire United States. They were spending gazillions of dollars. They'd hired huge amount of staff. They were required for hiring, you had to write a DEI statement if you wanted to be a professor at University of Michigan, where you basically swore allegiance to the whole DEI platform and everything. This week, they have completely dismantled the entire DEI program at the University of Michigan, one of the most leftist institutions in the United States. And this is happening all across the United States at universities. A big part of this was this pro-Hamas stuff. I mean, the pro-Hamas stuff might have been the best thing to happen to us in a long, long time. Because what it did was it finally exposed what's happening at the universities. So nothing changed October 7th in American universities. They were just as rotten to the core a day before as they were the day after. The only difference is the day after we saw it. And we have been talking about this for 20 years. But the donors, the people who write $100 million checks to Harvard and to Columbia and to Yale and to the University of Pennsylvania, they saw it for the first time. And they said, we're not writing checks to you guys if this is what you're teaching. Now, I don't know that it's gone deep enough. There's still a lot of work to do. But the left exposes itself. And it makes its own stupidity obvious. Because it's just evil. To promote Hamas after October 7th is just so straightforwardly, unequivocally evil. Anybody should be able to see it. So that's kind of on the optimistic side. And what to do about, so that's one level that we have to do. But I think the threat is wider than that. The fundamental threat has nothing to do with the crazy leftist agenda of the moment, which is just fashion. I agree. It'll change. It has to do with the fact that the very values of the West are being undermined. It has to do with what we talked about earlier about the loss of understanding what the Enlightenment stood for and the importance of the Enlightenment for the world, the importance of capitalism for freedom, all of that, the importance of reason, and individualism. And that should worry you. That is really scary, and that's on the left and on the right. That is not, that has a political home. They all hate reason. They all hate individualism. And there, the solution is to fight. That is, you can't just roll over. It's to talk. It's to write. It's to protest. It's to make your viewpoint clear, to known in the world. And you do that not just attacking DEI this, DEI that, but to attack the principle. I'm for individualism. DEI is racist. It treats people as a collective. I'm for capitalism. You know, businesses should be allowed to hire whoever they want and fire whoever they want, whenever they want, under whatever terms they want. So all labor law should be scrapped, not just DEI labor law. So we need to start talking about principles, the principles based and grounded in reason and based on individualism, and a complete rejection of collectivism and tribalism, left, right, who the F cares? I don't like the left, I don't like the right, I like freedom. And neither one of those are pro-freedom anymore. The political spectrum, the proper political spectrum is individualism and capitalism and freedom on one side, and collectivism. Collectivism of the left variety, of the right variety, of the centrist variety, of the, I don't know, newly invented variety. I don't care. Collectivism is bad. It's collectivism, statism. We're opposed to that. We're on the freedom, capitalist, and individualistic side, and we will fight for that. Yeah.
And could you comment on the conundrum that is China? China is a collectivist, communist country, yet the economy is doing so well. Have they somehow achieved a distinction between politics and economy?
So has China achieved this differentiation between politics and economics? The answer is no. What happened in China in 1978, you know, basically Mao died in 76 and Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 78. And Deng, what he does is he separates two forms of liberty, two forms of freedom. He basically says you can be free economically. You can't be free politically, but you can be free economically. Not everywhere in China. So he starts with, we'll start in this area close to Hong Kong, because Hong Kong's already there. And we'll start with this area called Guangzhou province. And we'll give you freedom, and we'll see. Do you become as rich as Hong Kong, or don't you? And they did, and they became as rich. And he said, okay, well, let's try in Shanghai, and let's try in a few other places. And everywhere they touched and provided economic liberty. That is, you could start a business, you can keep the benefits. There were billboards all over China. To be rich is good. To be rich is virtuous. In China, communist China, in the 80s and 90s. And he allowed all that. And when the first millionaire rose, you know, the first millionaire in China was a guy who sold, what do you call it, the nuts that you crack open? Sunflower seeds. He had the recipe for sunflower seeds. And he franchised it. And he became the first millionaire in Chinese history. And, you know, the Communist Party wanted to kill the guy. And Deng Xiaoping said, no, this is what we want. We want people to become millionaires. Now, he wasn't a good guy. Deng Xiaoping is also the guy who ordered the tanks out in Tiananmen Square because political freedom was being threatened. So when the students went out to Tiananmen Square and wanted political freedom, he said, no way you're going to get a political freedom, we're going to crush you. But you can still have your economic freedom. And the reforms, after Tiananmen Square, reforms were shut down and then they were reignited a few years later. So for a long time, China moved on this slowly liberating its economy, slowly providing more and more economic freedom while not allowing political freedom. And I remember talking to an engineer in Dongguan in China in 2004. And I said to him, doesn't it bother you that you don't get to elect your political leader? And his response was, as long as my standard of living goes up every year, as long as I have more opportunities every year, as long as my job is satisfying, as long as I have a choice of jobs and I can choose what I want to do, I don't care about voting. I don't care about politics. And I was thinking, I remember, because it was 2004, and I was thinking, God, I need to go back to the United States and choose between George W. Bush and John Kerry. I'll take growing standard of living over that choice. What the hell? So all of that seemed to work for China. So they became relatively rich. They're still very poor on a per capita GDP, much poorer than Australia, for example, on a per capita GDP. But they became richer, and they were very successful because of the economic liberty. But about 10 years ago, really with the rise of Xi Jinping coming to power, Xi Jinping realized something that in the West we've always known. That is, as the Chinese gain economic freedom, they will start demanding more and more political freedom. And he also, I think, believed that he didn't understand capitalism. He doesn't understand capitalism. He thinks there's a lot of waste, and he's a central planner. So what he started to do, starting in about 2013, but really in 2018, 2019, and then COVID gave him the ultimate excuse, was to shrink the amount of economic liberty. So now China is going through a period of shrinking economic freedom, in addition to no political freedom. And the reality of China right now is that the economy is doing terrible. Much worse than what you're reading, much worse than what they're being told, and there is no future. It's not gonna get better, because any solution they have is a statist solution. Any solution they have is either a Keynesian or Marxist solution without any economic liberty, without any flexibility, without any ability to adjust with an American economy or European economy has somewhat. The Chinese economy has none of that. So they are in real trouble. This is why I'm not convinced they're such a big threat, as a lot of other people are, because I think they're a declining power. They're going to lose whatever that great economic engine was because they've restricted the freedom. They are now, everybody said, ultimately, you're going to get economic freedom, you're going to get political freedom. And that's true. But also ultimately, if you don't give them political freedom, they won't have economic freedom either. And that's what's happening in China right now. For example, I saw a graph of the number of new tech entrepreneurs in China, new startups in China. And it was going like this in the 20 teens. It was unbelievable, the amount of entrepreneurs. And it's gone like that. It's fallen off a cliff. It's close to zero. There's almost no tech startups in China right now. So that's not a thriving economy. That's not success. Okay, this is going to be the last question.
Yeah. Firstly, thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Good. Thank you.
I have a question about an ideal US capitalist, the role of the Fed in that. So I'd love to get your thoughts on it, whether it's relevant and whether it's needed.
If we're talking about an ideal, there is no Fed. The Fed is an abomination. The Fed and all central bankers are a form of government taking control over the most important product in the economy, money, the means of exchange. And they do it for one reason and one reason only, in spite of all of their supposed explanations. And that is power and control. By controlling and owning the production of money, they own and control you. Everything you touch is not dependent on them. They can inflate, they can manipulate, they can raise interest rates, they can lower interest rates. The ideal system, which the United States has never really had, but Canada had and Scotland had for periods, I don't know about the history of banking in Australia, is free banking. It's a system in which banks are completely unregulated and completely detached from government, and they produce money. They produce money based on some kind of reserve. Maybe in the future money is Bitcoin or money is crypto. I don't know. I'd love to see the competition and see what shakes out, right? I'm skeptical about Bitcoin, but I'd love to see it try. Why not? I might be wrong. It's happened before. Let's experiment. And experimentation means freeing up the banking system completely, getting rid of the Federal Reserve, getting rid of, the laws that dictate which money you have to use. Legal tender laws, getting rid of legal tender laws, and let's have competition among currencies. And let the marketplace resolve what money should be and how much money should be produced. And just like everything else, healthcare should be completely privatized. Education should be 100% privatized. Money should be 100% privatized. The government should have no involvement in the economy. Zero, zilch, nada. Protect property rights, basically, and that's it.
This has been such a rare opportunity to be in the presence of some of the greatest defenders of the Enlightenment, free markets, and Western civilization. So a round of applause for Nikos and Yaron. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. You've been a great host and a really good, I guess, moderator, participant in the panel, both. And even though, we have our differences, it's great to be aligned to such an extent on really our political freedoms and the foundations that those political freedoms depend upon. So thank you. Thank you for organizing all this.
Oh, thank you to the other
organizers. The organizers who are here.
Tom.
Thank you, Tom. Put all this together. Adrian.
Thank you,
Adrian. Really appreciate it. And thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate it. And read Ayn Rand. And follow Brad on Twitter.
Yeah.
And follow Brad on YouTube.
Yeah.
Follow me on YouTube, Yaron Brook Show, and on Twitter, Yaron Brook.
And we'll be next door to have a beer if anyone wants to hang around with us.